So, hello everyone and welcome to this round of pre-recorded lectures. And what we're looking at in this class and the next class is going to be international crime and transitional justice. And then next class will turn more specifically to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and how that deals with international crime. Now, why we talk about these things in terms of human rights is one of the areas where there's a lot more development in terms of the enforcement of human rights and the protection of human rights is through international crime, particularly for the worst violations of human rights. And of course, the ICC is one of the main bodies there. But the ICC is only one of a number of different responses to transitions and power and criminal activities done by governments and so on. But we'll look at that later when we talk about transitional justice. But what we firstly have to address when we're talking about international crime is how we define international crime, because it gets used by different people in different situations. And we need to kind of define or just to outline where there are different understandings of what international crime is. So here we can break international crime into three kind of categories. Now, the first category is really crime that crosses borders, or transnational crimes, or sometimes called transnational aspects of crime. Because what's happening here is that there's a crime that's occurring in more than one state, which leads towards a kind of a bit of complexity in terms of how we define it as a crime and how to respond to that crime. Now, much of this is managed by, as we see here, the United Nations Convention on Transnational Crime. It might be transnational organized crime. The UNCTOC, I think it's the UNCTOC, I'll have to check that, it could be a mistake. But here it means that there's a crime that crosses a border, and that could be all the various forms of smuggling and trafficking. It could be money laundering and things like that. And this tends to be managed by national police. So these are not about international law being broken, it's about national law being broken in more than one country, which kind of internationalizes it. And so it's responded to by things like mutual legal assistance, which will come back, which is more than one police force working on this, and also things like extradition. Okay, so that's one category. The next category is criminal aspects of international law. And this is when an international law is broken in a way that it becomes a crime. So this is not about looking at domestic criminal systems, though often that kind of international and domestic crimes occur at the same time. But this is about when you break a law and that law is an international law. For example, the Torture Convention. If you torture someone, it's like you're breaking an international law, and individuals can do that. Now, not all international law has criminal aspects. You know, much of ICCPR and ICECSR, well, actually much of ICESCR doesn't have criminal aspects, but some of ICCPR does, like torture and slavery and so on. But just coming back to this here, when we look at conventions like Convention on Torture, the Palermo Protocol on Trafficking, the various CRC protocols, they do have aspects which criminalize certain activities. Okay, so again, this is a bit different than transnational crimes, because transnational crimes are going to be dealt with at a national level, whereas with there's some criminal aspects of international law, they can be dealt with differently through international law. And we'll come back to what that means soon. Then finally, and this is the most common way in which it's used, is for the worst or most serious crimes. These are crimes known as international crimes. Okay, and they are, and just looking at the next slide, they are things like the crime against humanity, genocide, war crimes, and this other category of crimes against peace or aggression, kind of the crime of starting a war. So all of these are seen to be the worst crimes that you can commit, and they have a very special status in some special category. Okay, so they're types of international crime. We see transnational crimes, which I mentioned before, like smuggling and laundering and trafficking and piracy there as well. It's kind of interesting that piracy is kind of like the first international crime, because it was criminalized back in the 1600s, when you had the pirates out in the high seas, like Blackbeard and I forget the other ones, Long John Silver and so on. But those laws against piracy have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay. Then we have the crimes which are kind of breaches of international law. And that's almost always attached to some kind of convention. Human trafficking, weapons trading, torture, child pornography. Now, actually, this could be not quite accurate because terrorism and hijacking planes is often transnational crimes. It's not quite breaches of international law because terrorism and hijacking planes don't always come out of international legal standards. But that just shows that often transnational crimes and breaches of international law, often it's quite blurry between them because, say, the law of trafficking can have a national law and an international law, and they can be tried by either one. Crimes of terrorism, some countries choose to use their own national terrorism law because it's stronger. I'm not really sure about the international treaties on that. So if you're looking at this, don't take the terrorism and hijacking planes too seriously because that's part of both. Okay, but these just we know there's a variety of crimes that really, eventually our focus will just be on the international crimes here. They are the most serious ones, and they're the ones which are subject to the ICC and what we'll look at eventually. Okay, but to deal with more about international criminal law and the main aspects, there's a couple of important legal concepts that we need to address. And that helps explain these differences between these categories. The first one's the concept of jurisdiction. We have talked about that previously in first semester. Jurisdiction means where the law speaks, juris the law, and diction speaking, or where it has power. We know there are a variety of different forms of jurisdiction. And this is important in terms of how international crimes are defined. Because national crimes are territorial. You rob a bank in a country and you're only subject to the criminal law of that country because that's like your average everyday domestic crime. But there are some forms of jurisdiction which are personal. And that means that a country has power over that person. Most commonly and almost always it's power over citizens. So, in some cases it's not. But it means that if you're a citizen of that country, they can charge you with a crime no matter where it occurs. There's no territorial limitations. So, for example, some countries have tax laws, and if you don't pay your tax, you can get in trouble, whether it's a crime or what type of actual punishment it is. It's going to vary. But just if you're a citizen of that country, you're expected to pay taxes to that country no matter where you are. Same thing with, say, United States and corruption. Doesn't matter where you commit corruption, you can be tried in the United States. That's if you're an American citizen. And then also there are some personal jurisdictions in terms of crimes, say like child sex and sex trafficking and drug trafficking and so on, that even if you're drug trafficking, say you're a Canadian and you're drug trafficking between Thailand and Malaysia, you could still be tried in Canada for that. Actually, this is just an example. I'm not quite sure if Canada has these laws, but in some countries you could still be tried for drug smuggling, even if you didn't smuggle the drugs into that country. It's going to vary country to country, but basically it means that there's jurisdictions over the person because of your citizenship. Now, this is relevant for things, say, like torture and trafficking and those conventions. It's also relevant for the ICC crimes as well, that we'll come back to later. Now, finally, is a definition of universal jurisdiction. This is the most powerful one. And this means that that state sees that crime as a crime no matter where it occurs, no matter who does it. So universal jurisdiction means that you see torture as a crime no matter who, no matter where. If you're in Indonesia, not a good example. If you're Thailand, which has ratified the Convention Against Torture, say a Nepali tortures a Bhutanese person in Bangladesh, doesn't matter. They'd still see it as a crime and they could still try it in their own country. Even though the citizens don't come from the country, there's no personal jurisdiction, there's no territorial jurisdiction. It doesn't matter, they can still try that crime. Okay, the next one is the concept of extradition, which is kind of interesting, but not, it's kind of relevant to understanding how crime works. And often people get this kind of mixed up. Because also remember that the Convention Against Torture and Convention on Enforced Disappearances both are extradition treaties as well. But an extradition is where you commit the crime in one country and that person then goes to another country and the state where the crime is committed wants them extradited back to face justice. And so it gives that other country the authority to search out and arrest that person and send them back. So basically, extradition means that a state can surrender someone or send someone to face court in another state. So, often in Thailand, you have criminals coming from Europe and in North America. They rob a bank there and they escape to Thailand or Cambodia because they know it's fairly safe and fairly cheap. But eventually the Thai police, under instructions from America or Europe or wherever, would capture that person and arrest them and send them back to face justice in that country. Now with extradition, it's based on this idea of dual criminality. Well, there's actually two sorts. There's kind of list extradition, where you've got a list of all the crimes that are extraditable. Or dual criminality means that if both countries see it as a crime, then you can have an extradition. Okay, but you need to have that. You can't be extradited for something which is not seen as a crime in that country. It's a feature of numerous treaties, as I mentioned before. CAT and ICED, and ICED have extradition treaties on them. And it means that that state, even though they're not a citizen of that state, at first that state can go and arrest them, or even though they haven't committed a crime in that country, the police can arrest them. Now, there are some limits to extradition. So many countries won't send people back to face a death penalty or torture, or send them back if they don't think they'll get a fair trial. Now, this is what's happened, say, with Julian Assange, that they're saying he won't get a fair trial in America, so we shouldn't extradite him back. Or for many Europeans not being extradited to America because of the death penalty. Okay, just quickly some recent controversies about extradition. We see the Hong Kong extradition law, which started this whole reign of protests that went there, and that was for Hong Kong people could be extradited to China to face justice there, even if they hadn't committed a crime in China. The Julian Assange case, as mentioned before, and what was known as extraordinary rendition, where the United States was kind of arresting suspect terrorists in other countries and kind of kidnapping them to send them back to America or to Guantanamo Bay to face justice. And that was seen as a whole violation of this standard of extradition. Okay, and the last one is this mutual legal assistance. And basically this is where states can help each other to do their police work, whether it's interviewing witnesses or collecting evidence or locating people to arrest or even arresting people, are all parts of mutual legal assistance, which is often needed for extradition. Okay, so that kind of gives the broad framework of some of the main tools and ideas about how international criminal law works in its varieties. But soon we'll start focusing on the more serious, on international crime as the more serious crime and how we got to that.